another 80s golden age of comedy show. I'm your host, Bruce Starr, and we've just been, it's been such a great experience working with, years ago, during the 80s, working with so many comedians and being able to call them friends. It all happened because I was put on the doorstep of the Improv in 1981, and my friend Mitch Ween said, "Go in there, look for Bruce Smirnoff, look for Mark Goldstein and Barry Martyr, and go in there, and that's where you're going to live from now on." And you know what? It's what I did. I went back there every night, just hanging out, looking around, watching, going in and catching the comedians, before anybody knew their name, even before evening at the Improv, pretty much. And it was just a fantastic experience to be able to sit and watch them work, sit with them after, hear what they were talking about, hear what they talked to between themselves and what they talked to with friends. And it was just a fantastic experience being at the Improv with Bud Friedman and Mark Lonow, and experiencing them and their interactions with the comedians. It was really, really priceless. And then when evening at the Improv hit, goodness gracious, the place turned into a studio, and it was jammed, mobbed with fun people and great hosts, special host Phyllis Diller, Milton Berle. Oh man, I can just go on forever to tell you the people that I saw hosting the show. It was just an experience, and I'm so glad to continue to explore the Improv, explore 80s golden age of comedy. And today is no different. Steve Young, I believe, all the way from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you. I knew about you years and years and years ago, but I don't think we ever worked together. I don't think we ever knew each other, but you've done a lot, and I want to welcome you to the show.
Well, it's nice to be here. And as I might have mentioned to your producer, which I think was you, prior to the show, that I've done a lot of things, including in comedy, mostly because there is nothing that I do well. And so I try to do as much as I can of everything.
I've heard that story before, including from myself. You try to go after what you love doing, and if it doesn't work, you got to go slightly to the left and slightly to the right. And I've been doing that my whole life. So, Steve, tell us about you. I love hearing about people literally from where they grew up and how they first got interested in comedy. And then how do you get interested in comedy and saying, I want to do comedy, and actually getting on stage? I'd love to hear your version of your life.
Wow. Being that I'm so old, I do have many years. I'll see if I can condense those in terms of how it refers to comedy. But I was always the kid in the class who it's not so much I was the funny one, but I would whisper the obvious jokes to Bill Gaybauer, who will say them out loud. He would get the laughs, unless he did not get the laugh, and then he would say, well, Young told me. And so that was the behind the scenes me. I went on to 4 colleges. Well, I was in the Army back during Vietnam, and they asked me to leave after a while. I then went to Temple University in Philadelphia, where they asked me to leave. Then I went to Temple Night School, which people said you could not fail at, and I thought that was a challenge, and I failed out of there. Then I went to Mercer County Community College in Trenton. I went to 4 different colleges. I never got a credit, and I continued. That was pretty much my life until about the time I was 19 or 20. No, it's 21 out in Los Angeles, and I went to the Troubadour and on a comedy night. That was early in the night. In fact, Bill Medley was on later on that night. And that was the first time I actually stood in front of an audience where I got a lot of laughs doing kind of George Carlin type things. I got married, went back to the East Coast with a couple of children already in place. And I had to get a job, but every so often I went to the, back then in the Village, I went to the Gaslight and to the Bitter End and the Village Gate, where I had my first paying gig opening for Oscar Brand. And then I kind of had to work. And really towards the end, around 29 years old, I came back from New York to Philadelphia, and there was no real comedy scene. And we tried to have comedy nights all over the place. I got together with some people, and I found a room that really had about 325 seats. I was a comedian, but I was kind of the person who could wear a three-piece suit and talk at the same time. And we opened up that club. It was an immediate success. The Comedy Works in Philadelphia. Great acts that were out of Philadelphia, like Wayne Cotter and Judy Toll and Mike Egan and Tom Wilson and just a lot of people that over the years developed there. Plus, we got to bring in the best of New York and LA. Back then, there were very few comedy clubs. This was about 79 or 80. And we were paying real money. So we could get people like Eddie Murphy, Jay Leno, Seinfeld, Bob Nelson. I said Mark Wiener and the Wienerettes I told you about, Mac and Jamie, Bruce Baum, Bob Saget, and Bill Kirkenbauer, and Elaine Boozler and Paula Poundstone and Bob Shaw and everybody that you know. And I'm really leaving out a ton of other. Well, you had on Barry Diamond, who I adored, and still do, and Richard Lewis, pal, and great. And really, we were like a comedy family, a comedy community. And I opened up a number of clubs, including the first one in a casino in Atlantic City. And then I went out to LA, where I became a comedy writer, wrote for shows like Sybil, the Steve Harvey Show, Me and the Boys, the Second Family Affair, Boy Meets World, some HBO stuff, a little bit with Leno, and then I also went over to the Comedy Store and I was a regular at the Comedy Store, so I did stand up also. And again, with another marriage, went back to the East Coast, and I started writing books, children's, adults, fiction, non-fiction, and really in my later years, I'm back on stage again. In fact, hoping that I don't know if you've heard about this virus thing that they have here, but that's...
Did hear something about it.
Yeah, it's keeping us from actually getting paid. Up until this point, it was only the club owners that kept us from being paid. And now actually I'm performing. There is a club I'm performing on Saturday, but that takes you up to date. And I think I covered most of it. Was there anything?
A lot of years. You covered a lot of years. So let's slow it down. Let's bring it back to the 80s.
Okay.
Tell me about your experience either in LA or in Philadelphia with the comedians that you spoke about, some of your memories, what it was like to bring those acts in for the first time, people that you didn't know and just heard of. What was it like to work with a Paul Reiser? How was he? How were a lot of those? Tell me about those guys, like kind of one at a time.
Well, first of all, most of them by far were great people, and it was really rock and roll. The house was packed. I had like 6 clubs, the main one in Philadelphia in Society Hill, and lines out constantly down the street. Um, we had cement walls, very high ceiling. The reaction of the audience was roars. It bounced off. It was just great. We did TV shows from there. I would say Riser. Riser was the same way off stage as he was on stage, just adorable, and he was a killer act, and just a sweetheart. Everybody came in, and it was like we were, just everybody was peer level, and even the guys that worked the door. Who seated people, etc., were all people who wanted to become comedians. Tom Wilson from Back to the Future was Biff to Back to the Future. He worked the steps, getting people to stay in line.
Let's stop with him for a second.
Sure.
Let's talk about, because people don't really know much about him other than he played such a pivotal role in Back to the Future. They don't associate him, or I don't, with comedy. So lead me through your experience with him and your memories about how he got out to LA and kind of got found.
Well, with Tom, he was an amateur comedian, and he, on stage, and he would on weekends work the door, whatever help we needed there, and he wanted to get up on stage. And I said, okay, I'll give you a 10-minute spot. And normally we had 4 acts, but I was going to, each one, usually better than the other. And really, back then, everybody was great. There were no holes in the show. It wasn't like we put an amateur on. So I was very careful about who I put on stage. The minute it was Tom Wilson. Now he's credited as Thomas F. Wilson. The moment he walked on the stage, he killed. And that 10 minutes, he blew the house away. And so I gave him, an opening act position, blew the house away. We moved him up to middle quickly, blew the house away. You could not follow Tom. Tom was a killer act. He went out to LA with his girlfriend, Judy Toll, another funny, silly, wonderful person. And they went out there, and Tom was really, he went to school for theater. I believe it was at Villanova. I'm not 100% sure. And when he went out there, pretty quickly, he got booked into the Back to the Future franchise, which he said to me was probably the best thing that ever happened to him and the worst thing that ever happened to him. While he's still performing, and you can see him every so often on TV shows and movies, pretty much he was stereotyped. He was Biff as soon as he hit the screen, it's Biff from Back to the Future. But great guy, sweetheart, continues to be. He was success. I know he goes and he was continuing to do stand-up too. And up until pandemic, I guess he still was. And even if you go and find him on Facebook, he does these short videos of him being around the world, and they're hysterical. They really are. So that's Tom Wilson.
Tell me about some of the other guys because I know that several of the fellas were able to cross the country and find some success either at the Comedy Store or the Improv that came out of the Philadelphia area.
Yeah, well, Dom Irera. Dom he played my Wildwood Club, and he did play my Philadelphia club. He went out there before really, it wasn't that he had to work his way through Philadelphia. He was already in New York. But he would come in. Paul Tompkins went up, and Paul's had pretty good success after a while. I'm trying to think of the names that actually started. Wayne Cotter went out. He was on Carson and Leno tons of times. But we had a lot of repeat guys. Guys loved to play the club. There was a really big stage. Bob Nelson developed a lot of his act there. It really was like a party every night. Larry Miller, Joe Bolster, some guys that you might not have heard of that went on to successful acting careers, as opposed to, Ray Romano, obviously. These guys were coming up through before they became stars, before they were all really good. And then we lucked into people like Jim Carrey, who might have been. Jim Carrey actually worked on stage when our mic didn't work, our sound system didn't work, and it was one of the most amazing nights because what he would do, we tried to fix it, we couldn't. He said, just leave it alone. He would do a joke, the audience would roar, and then shut down immediately because they wanted to hear the next one. And if you've ever seen Jim do a stand-up act, it's, it's Andy Kaufman, Jim Carrey, Bob Nelson. They're just, really, they broke the envelope. It was everything. And in fact, it was a middle act for him. I went on stage, and watching Jim's act, I might have been the best I ever was that weekend, just because I had the sense of how much he gave to his act, how much he just put it out there with as powerfully as he did. So I took my act, which was a little bit bizarre too, and I just let it go wherever. And because I could talk plenty of times when things were horrible, and it was one of the best nights of my life. And that's just by watching another comic and their craft, and you trying to get the sense of how can I feed into that, not copy it, but how can I take what he has and put it through what I do.
Yeah, I heard a lot of the guys say that. I haven't heard anybody say I didn't want to follow that, but I have heard a lot of the guys say, I am so glad that I got a chance to follow Robin and people like Jim Carrey, because they take the audience to such a excited level that they're staying there. And when you come on board, they're ready to keep up at that level. So I didn't realize that before I did this show, that they actually like being able to go after a Robin or after a Jim Carrey.
You sort of get that because you go to the Comedy Store or the Improv or the Laugh Factory, and there's so many on the lineup. So sooner or later, or Robin would come in, and he'd immediately be put on stage and bump other people. But I remember one night I was also managing acts too, and I managed an act out of Philadelphia who I think is the greatest prop comedian. All prop comedians would say the same thing too, and that is the legendary Wid, Michael Baldwin. And he went on stage at the Improv in LA. We had him out there to do a couple TV shows, and Robin followed him. And he got to the microphone. He said, "How do I follow that?" And that had to be the greatest compliment that any act could ever get, because Wit is brilliant, but he takes his props and he might do 10 jokes on every prop. Some of them for the very first time, meaning that he just came up with ad-libbed it right at that moment. But there's a guy who really was great, but never really got out of Philadelphia. Everybody knows him in the business, but never was able, from a business sense, to get out of Philadelphia. But a killer act.
Wow, I don't really know anything about him. And
you mentioned it to somebody else about prop comedians. I remember who's the prop comedian who had the wigs? Rip Taylor.
Rip Taylor.
Yeah, Rip Taylor used to steal from Wid and admit it. I love what Wid does. I use his stuff all the time. And you're going, I'm not going to mention the people, but you don't mention it when you're stealing. But Rip, was the star, so he could do it. By the way, I also won on the Gong Show and I won on the Dating Game. Those were probably the two biggest credits in my life.
Which one was more memorable for you?
The Gong Show, because I did my act that actually Lenny Schultz wanted to buy.
That's who I was thinking about. I was going to say Lenny, but that's funny.
Yeah, Lenny wanted to buy something from me. I used to do a ventriloquist act with a rubber chicken. And the I'm not a ventriloquist. And so the only thing I could do as a ventriloquist was say the word, okay. And so everything I did had the chicken saying, okay. And I mean, I had him doing everything, going through hoops. Every time he did a trick, I poured popcorn over him. It was Lenny Schultz at that time. But yeah, it was at the Dating Game. I was 21 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. I won.
Did they set you up with a pretty cool chick, or how did that work?
Well, the funny thing is, my girlfriend at the time, who I was living with, did not want me to go on the trip. It was supposed to go, I think, Vegas or Reno or something like that. And so I called up the girl that I was supposed to go with, who was a very younger, I don't know, 18, 19 years old. And I said, look, we're going to be there a whole weekend, so I'm going to be bringing a lot of drugs. I just want to know, is there anything that you would prefer to have? And she called the show producers and said she's going to cancel. And they called me and said, who do you want to bring? And I ended up bringing my girlfriend.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Back then, these were, how do I get on TV? That was it. You'd do anything to get on TV. And that's, I mean, I would go to the Steve Allen show and I'd sit in the front row, and my mother in Philadelphia would see me for about a week and a half sitting in the front row because they kept using the same film roll over and over again.
Oh, wow.
But, you sit there and you go, you watch Steve Allen and Louis Nye and Tom Poston and all those guys that were like, and then later on in your life, you get to work with the people. You get, you spend time with Milton Berle and I had my club professor, Irene Corey and Henny Youngman, and then later Lily Tomlin.
So that's what I want to hear about. I don't want to just hear their names. I want to hear about how they were with you, and how was it being with them?
Well, Milton Berle, I think, got a bad reputation, not only, famous for stealing jokes, but the fact that he was like, too much into himself, and, he wasn't really a good guy. Well, I was at the Friars Club. He didn't know who I was, but I was just sitting opposite, and he asked me what I do. I said, well, comic, working to try to make a big. He spent a half hour talking about the business, explaining how it works, what you have to do. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to spend time with me. Henny Youngman. I sat next to Henny at a benefit, and people were coming over to him over and over, asking for autographs. And he was very gracious, and he would give them, but he was eating dinner. And while he's eating dinner, he'd do this. He would take a roll. He'd be looking at the person who was talking to him. He'd take a roll, take a knife and put it in a pat of butter and rub it on his hand. And then he would take a bite out of the bread, and he'd keep talking. And then he'd take another pat of butter and roll it on his hand and take a bite of the bread. And I thought to myself, that is so funny. Mm-hmm. He was doing that for me. He was just being a funny guy. And he wasn't a kid then. I mean, he was older already. But that's a comic. Those are the guys that you go, there's reasons that they made it big. It's reason they were funny people, not only having funny material.
Absolutely. So one of the guys who's truly an enigma, and I've spoken about him probably too many times in the shows, was, everybody loved Robin. But then there was the guy that went on Taxi, and he was one character on Taxi. And then he was another character when he was in the comedy clubs.
Yeah.
And you mentioned him. So what was it like working with that guy?
Well, I never worked with Andy.
Did he come to Philadelphia is really what I was asking.
No, he never played the clubs, but I want to tell you about who he was by a very close friend of mine. I was playing at Igby's in West LA.
Yes.
And so this is one night I'm there and I kill. I mean, during the entire act, I kept stopping to say, folks, it's not as funny as you think. You're overreacting, and that got laughs. And I mean, it's one of those nights that it didn't matter what you said. And that was great. And the only person there, so I was there the very next week, and now the owner, Jan Smith, was there. And the only person from the previous week was Rosie O'Donnell. And I did the same act, dead, nothing. And I said it was a little bit, my act was a bit off kilter, So did the act, not a word, even during the act. I said, Rosie, tell them how I was, this is funny stuff. And she just went like this. And I walked off stage feeling pretty low. As I pass by, the next act is Elaine Boozler, and she passes me, And she said, that took balls. And I went outside, and I really thought she was really putting me down. It took balls to do such crap. And, because we are so overly sensitive about ourselves as comics. The next day she calls me up and she says, you seem a little bit off, when you left. And I said, well, you kind of told me, that I was not really good. You told, that it took balls. And she said, you're misunderstanding. I meant that took Andy Kaufman balls. And she had lived with him for quite a while. And in fact, there's a great article when he passed away that she did for Esquire about Andy. And so I said to her, and I really, really was a fan of Andy Kaufman's. And I said, what did Andy say about or do when he bombed? And she said, he never thought he bombed. He thought the audience bombed. And I said, that is amazing, because what confidence you must have in yourself. And boy, I don't know many people who do have that confidence when the audience basically says to them, we don't like it. And to me, in awe of a guy who was willing to take that many risks, all those things he did that people were saying, don't do, don't try. And he took it as far as he could. If you've ever seen the documentaries about him, brilliant stuff. And there is a thing Elaine put on Facebook the other day about her being on one of his specials. And it's just a small piece, but it is hysterical. She's hysterical, and he's being pure Andy Kaufman in it. So no, never. Andy was already past us when I opened up in 80. Andy was already in effect a star.
Yeah. I sat in at the Improv for two of his performances that were memorable, not necessarily in a good way. One was when he had his cereal, his milk and cereal, and that's all he did. He had his spoon, and he looked up and looked around and took another spoonful of milk. Didn't say a word, really, just had cereal with milk. That was one show that I was scratching my head about. I said, okay, that's Andy, but there were no laughs or anything. And then the second time was even weirder, because he developed a cyst on his neck.
Yep, saw that one.
And he invited everyone up on stage. There was a line, I could remember it like it happened yesterday. There was a line to go up on stage with Andy to touch his exposed cyst.
He did that in the Man in the Moon film that Jim Carrey did, playing Andy. That scene was in there.
So he does certainly test. I think I liked his wrestling things much.
Yeah, I think the comedians who tested Gilbert Gottfried, Gilbert, would do things that aren't, weren't typical, but every comedian, I remember at Catch a Rising Star in New York, he would go late in the evening, because I guess they weren't 100% sure that he would do something that would be acceptable, but every comic went in to watch him. And I booked him, because I just love that complete. But he was a little bit different. I mean, he got very show busy later on, but guys like him, he would take risks. I thought Bob Nelson took risks too, but Bob was he was so solid. It didn't matter what he was doing. People loved him so much. His act was, he was like a little kid on stage, and he would rock the place too, really. And there was a comedy team, Bob Meyer and Bob Young, Meyer and Young, who became regulars. Their name is up on the wall on the outside of the Comedy Store. I used to manage them. They would rock that place. They were so good. We had good teams. The Funny Boys, Jonathan and John Schmock and Jimmy Valley.
Yeah.
These back then, there were comedy teams who were really just top-notch acts and really made it work. I don't know today if there are any. I mean, there obviously are, but I don't know any that do the things that those guys did. And here's the thing about comedy back then. Whenever they would walk on the stage, there was something new that they would do. There was not like, I'm going to do the same act over and over again. They would prepare something different each time so that when you wanted to watch the show. You wanted to watch every show they did for the week or the weekend because you knew there was going to be new things happening, even though, you know, the framework of their act was really based on the stuff they knew would work. They were always willing to try new things, or at least it looked like they were trying to do new things.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about it is you never knew what they were doing. You know, were they trying to? I remember, you know, being at the Improv, and they would bring up their tape recorders, place the
Yeah.
tape recorder on the piano or on the stool in front of them, and just try material. And you know, that's what you got when you went there. I remember Jerry Seinfeld doing that all the time, and a lot of those guys bringing that tape recorder and trying stuff out. And lots of times it was funny, but you know, lots of times it wasn't.
Yeah, and today you'll see anybody who has 5 minutes thinks that they can be a headliner by somehow taking that 5 minutes and draw it into 45 or an hour. You really, every week we knew, and to have people like Rick Overton, you know, I would have Rick Overton and Mark Schiff on the same bill, and after the show was done, and then they would come back on stage and do improv for the audience. And of course, Rick is one of the all-timers. I mean, him and Robin Williams used to get on stage all the time, but it was great even to go like into Philadelphia. Another comedian who I don't know, well, if you went back, who was unbelievably good and died much, much, much too young, was Ronnie Shakes.
Yeah.
Ronnie, Carson loved him, and Ronnie was a great guy, but his material was gold. Even if you go on YouTube today and watch it, it was just brilliant stuff. There wasn't that there were generic comedians out there, but they were never going to make it big. But the guys that were special, I keep saying the same ones: Paul Provenza, Larry Miller, Reiser, and Seinfeld. You know, that sort of level as they came through out of the New York comics. Always brought something new and really, in some cases, brilliant to the table.
Yeah, I learned from doing these shows that what set the headliners apart in the beginning from the wannabes that were really not going to go anywhere were the guys that talked about themselves, the guys that talked about their own experiences and then reached out into the world with their perception about experiences that were going on in the world. But it wasn't just what was going on in the world, it was how they felt about it and how they reacted to it.
Well, I remember having Dennis Leary at the club, and something happened that week, and he did about 15 minutes on it. And I thought, how brilliant is this? That he actually, to a paying crowd, can do a really funny and a large amount of time on something that just happened. Old timer.
Jackie Mason?
Jackie Mason. Yeah. Jackie Mason could do that too. He could take something that was just happening and put it in the Jackie Mason style, and it would be hysterical. By the way, this is one of the funniest things that ever happened at the club was, and by the way, the other one I forget to mention is Dennis Wolfberg. Dennis was a killer act and a lovely guy when he came to the club. I had Professor Irwin Corey, who I had as a kid. I loved him and what he did in movies and on TV shows. And if you viewers don't know him, he was like the professor. He would come out there with a long coat on. Sometimes he would have that graduation hat on his head. Well, we had a long stage, and in the middle of the stage was a door that you would walk out on. The person who actually built the stage for me, my brother-in-law Jimmy, put the door in upside down by mistake. So you had to turn the doorknob the opposite way to open it. Well, I was emceeing, and I said, sometimes, you have a legend on stage and you sit there and you go, I am so proud to announce somebody like this I've known for years as just a brilliant comedian. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Arinkori. And I turn like this, I look, and I see the door handle turning, but not opening the door. And it's just, then he starts pushing it, but the door handle, and you see the whole stage background just shaking, and the audience starts to laugh because they know Professor Arinkori is standing back there and can't open the door. And finally it stops. He goes around to one of the wings that we had. We had wings on each side of the stage. Comes through the wing, does not look at the audience. Comes around, looks at the door handle, and he's trying to think. And finally goes, and he goes back through the exit and comes back where the door is and goes to turn. And again, it starts shaking.
Nice.
That took about 10 minutes. He never said a word, and the audience was on the floor.
Nice. So one of the last things I want to talk to you about, because you went pretty quickly from wanting to be in show business to all of a sudden being on stage. And that's a long trip there to develop 5, 6, or 7 or 8 minutes to enough to have confidence to get up on stage. Where did you get your material from?
Well, it's interesting. I was influenced by guys like Steve Martin and George Carlin, and kind of did that. And my acts were kind of silly, like doing what I was doing in early years was more or less just shtick in terms of being very silly, like a ventriloquist act with a chicken. I had a 7-minute bit of a impressionist who could only do one impression, Richard Nixon. And so I was making fun of these things because I was never really confident to do my own thing. The interesting thing is what's come to be in the last 5 years of doing comedy is I do everybody else's act. What I do, and usually I'm put in as the closer, and these are people that I may never have seen before. I write new punchlines to their material, and my punchlines are pretty absurd. So I usually go on stage and say, I was going to do my own act, but it's real. I watch the other guys and they're way better than me. And there's no reason to waste your time doing crap when these guys are gold. So I'll just do theirs again. And then I just go and I start a rant about using some of what they talked about and then throwing in punchlines that I make up along the way. And it's sort of, so what did I go from being creative to being an actual thief during the show. And so it's, it comes from different places, but I mean, I love, my mother played Shelley Berman, Bob Newhart records. I love Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, the 2,000-year-old men. When I met them, it was just, you fall apart, because these are guys. And by the way, Mel Brooks is exactly Mel Brooks off stage, on stage, a sweetheart. But all those guys that were back there, and I had to say, I had the Bill Cosby albums too, and all of them, I just sat every single day playing those records of those guys. And when I would watch Carson at night, I would cringe when a comedian they used to have the comics come on in the first 15 minutes. I would cringe when they wouldn't do well. It was so highly related to me, relatable. And I said to my mother, and I think I was 18 years old, I said, I want to be a comedian. And I remember exactly where I was when I said it. And she said, that's 1,000,000 to 1 shot. And I went, well, that's my mother, and I thought, like, from that point on, my thought, when anybody says they want to be something like a comedian or whatever artist, and I'll go, it may be 1,000,000 to 1 shot, but you can be that one. You really can. And the whole idea is just commit to it. Don't worry about the success, worry about your material, worry about bringing something to the table that's unique and your own voice. And that's whether you're a writer or you're a comic itself. And I just adored comedians. I adored comedy, and I just wanted to be part of it.
And how valuable is that to hear that from somebody like you who's been on both sides of the mic, standing in front of the mic, doing stand up at the great places, and also being a comedy club owner. The information that you just put out there, this show is going to be heard for years to come. And I'm sure by a lot of young comedians who are wondering, how the heck do I get started? What do I have to do? How do I do it? And that was super, super helpful. So, one other thing
And
before
I'll
we
be and then I'll be dead, so I could be a legend.
well stay around a little bit longer because there's probably some more work that you have to do.
I'm hoping, and this goes to bookers too, right?
I'm sure. I'm
Okay.
sure
All
they'll
right.
eventually see it. So,
Okay.
two last questions.
Sure.
One is, uh, what would you do differently, knowing what you know now? What would you do differently, or what would you like to take back? And the other is, what was like the highlight of your show business career?
I, you know, I think the highlight was when I became a comedy writer on television, and and there were other comedians who were working behind the scenes too who became comedy writers. But yesterday, when Cloris Leachman passed away, so I'm already ruining the dating of this show. But I wrote for a show called Maybe This Time. Betty White starred in it, Marie Osmond was in it, and Cloris guest starred. And
Mitchell
just
Bank. I talked to Mitchell Bank about that the other day.
oh, really? Rick Siegel?
No,
Okay, Rick is a manager. He was in the audience that day. He managed Craig Ferguson, who was also on the show, and and Carol Channing was in the audience, and I remember looking around and going, Cloris Leachman, Betty White,
whew.
Craig, and Carol Channing in the audience, who called me over. I had written that episode and told me how good it was. I still have the script with everybody's signature on it. And the whole time she was talking to me, I couldn't remember a word she said. All I'm thinking to myself is, God, she sounds just like Carol Channing. and she, and I'm talking to Carol Channing. I never stopped being a fan.
Yes.
And to this day. And even like Richard Lewis came back into town. And I ended up opening for him at a club in Philadelphia. Still, it's like these guys are just so wonderful. That might have been the highlight. What I would have done different would have treated comedy like it was a 40-hour-a-week job, because if you work a few hours and you're trying to make a joke work and it's not working, you're frustrated. But if you treat it as a whole job and say 8 hours a day, I'm going to work on that joke, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, and all I come out of it was one lousy joke, that's a failure normally. But if I would have treated it like a job, at the end of 50 weeks, 1 year, what would I have? I'd have about an hour of great material. That's headliner type stuff. If I would have treated, and I don't know many people who do, but if I would have treated comedy like a job, not just my hobby that I was getting paid for, I think I don't know where I would have gone. But the way I did it, I've experiences that I would have never imagined. I've done some things. I've accomplished things. I mean, I'm still looking over there at my Gong Show trophy. I've accomplished things that I would, I always say I have the longest resume in the unemployment line, but I would have accomplished things that you just look back on and go, that is so cool. Yeah. So I don't know if I would have done it any differently. The only thing I'd say, I'd probably work harder at doing it better.
Yeah, I think all of us feel that way. Certainly my memory of working back then is exactly the same. I would have liked to have taken it more seriously. One of the reasons I didn't was I really didn't want to be an agent, because I heard everybody hated their agents, and I didn't want to be someone that people hated. So I never really wanted to stay there. But I was always, behind the scenes. I never wanted to do anything on stage or anything. But You know, it's a great business. I feel like I'm getting some of it back here, dealing with some of the greats, some of the people that are saying yes to doing this show. It's spectacular. The people I've already had on the show, it's been, wonderful. And I want to thank you for coming on and uh, sharing your experiences, sharing what it was like for you, and also being a wonderful teacher. I mean, you've really shared a lot of great information that will help comedians
Well,
try to pick out.
the funny thing is, I flunked out of Temple University, but I ended up teaching there humor writing,
Oh,
which shows their credibility. Well, I want to thank you for having me here because I have nothing else to do.
well, listen, we both can go to dinner now because we're both on the East Coast and we can both have a great meal and have a very good memory of just a great show. And I want to thank you, Steve, for coming on board. And listen, let's keep in contact. Let's figure out ways that we can continue to help each other.
Do you have my new address to send the check to?
I overlooked that, but let me check my account. Oh, I don't have.
Venmo, Venmo,
Mhm.
Venmo or PayPal, no problem.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.
Good
And
night.
thank you, everybody, for watching another edition of the 80s Golden Age of Comedy. Visit the website, say hello there, and we'll see you here again. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.